Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is the Fujifilm X-T30, a retro-styled mid-range mirrorless camera costing $899 or 849 UK pounds, and aimed at enthusiasts who want the quality and flexibility of the X system, but in a smaller, lighter, and more affordable package. Like the X-T20 and X-T10 before it, the X-T30 inherits a number of key features from its more sophisticated sibling, in this case the flagship X-T3. In this video I'll show you everything you need to know about the X-T30, what's new over the X-T20, and how it differs from the X-T3. I'll also compare it to the Sony A6400, which costs roughly the same. If you find my reviews useful, you can support me by subscribing, treating me to a coffee, or treating yourself to my in-camera book, all using the links below. Now back to the camera. The X-T30 inherits the 26 megapixel APS-C X-Trans 4 sensor and image processor which made its debut on the X-T3. In fact, the X-T30 leapfrogs the X Pro line to become only the second body to feature Fujifilm's latest sensor. So not only is the photo quality the same as the flagship X-T3, it also means the X-T30 inherits phase detect autofocus across the entire frame, as well as the latest collection of film simulations including Eterna for natural looking video, and the neat monochrome adjustments which I'll show you later. What it still doesn't have though is built-in image stabilization, not surprising given Fujifilm's history and range, but still disappointing especially if, like me, you enjoy shooting with prime lenses that lack OIS. For now, the only Fujifilm body with built-in image stabilization is the X-H1. While the top mechanical burst speed of 8 frames per second is slower than the 11 frames per second of the X-T3, it's still quick enough for most action, and if you want faster still, the X-T30 inherits all of the X-T3's electronic shutter bursts, up to 20 frames per second with a full frame, or up to 30 frames per second with a 1.25 times crop. It also offers the X-T3's pre-burst capture mode for grabbing moments prior to fully pushing the shutter, great for capturing unpredictable action like birds taking off, and I'll show you that later on. In terms of video, the X-T30 may miss out on 4K at 60p, but still allows uncropped 4K between 24 and 30p, albeit in shorter clip lengths limited to 10 minutes. I'll show you all of the video features later on, but first let's have a look around the body. At first glance, the X-T30 looks the same as its predecessors, sharing essentially the same compact body and vintage details. The grip has been subtly reshaped and it's possible to just about wrap all your fingers around the front, but if your little finger is regularly left dangling, you can always fit the optional hand grip, which boosts the height a little. I personally loved the look and feel of the X-T30, and I could just about wrap all of my fingers around the grip here, but again, if your little finger is left dangling, or if you've got bigger hands or like using larger lenses, you'll probably be better off shooting with the X-T3, which has a much bigger, more comfortable grip, and it also sports weather sealing, something that's still lacking on the X-T30. And before I move on, it's worth pointing out that the Sony A6400 at roughly the same price point as the X-T30 has a bigger, chunkier grip that I personally found more comfortable and secure to hold, and it also has weather sealing, although ultimately I prefer the control system on the Fujifilm. The top of the camera is unchanged from the X-T20, which means you have a wealth of manual controls and dials, starting on the left hand side with the drive mode dial, the advanced filter positions, the panorama setting. We have the continuous drive positions and the bracketing ones too. These are all configurable in the main menu system so that you know exactly what you want it to do when you turn it to these settings, and there's the movie mode at the end. Around this is a color switch which pops up the flash at the top here. This is a feature you don't get on the X-T3. To the right of the viewfinder head is the dedicated shutter speed dial, and I'll show you more about that in just a moment. To the right of that, an exposure compensation dial with a range of plus or minus 3 EV and a custom position here to extend that further. Now, none of these 3 dials are lockable, but they're all sufficiently stiff that I didn't accidentally turn them when I removed the camera from my bag or in general operation. If you've got a really tight bag, I found the one that's most susceptible is the compensation dial, so keep your eye on that, but in general I didn't experience any problems with that. Around the shutter speed dial you also have a fully automatic switch. This is handy if you're handing the camera to someone who doesn't know how to use it, and it basically disables all of these dials. It's like a don't panic switch. And here is the shutter release button, which is threaded for old style cable releases, and around there a power collar. And just perched here in the top right corner is the function button. I'll show how to customize that in just a moment. And on the rear and the front you have pushable control dials. As you know, Fujifilm lets you manually adjust the shutter speeds using a dial on the top of the camera, and you can see those shutter speeds appearing on the screen here. The dial lets you select them at 1 EV increments, with the exception of the fastest flash sync speed here. If you want to access finer increments, just choose the closest one using the top dial and then adjust it using the rear thumb control here. So that gives you 1/3 EV increments. And this continues until you go to the slowest manually selectable shutter speed of 1 second. Beyond here, you've got the bulb setting, but much more exciting is the T mode, which I'm going to show you now. Now, T basically relegates all shutter speed control to this rear dial, and as you can see, I can choose the full range of shutter speeds here. I can go all the way up to the fastest shutter speed, 4,000th of a second. If I was using the electronic shutter, it would go up to all the way to 32,000th of a second. But more exciting for me as someone who's into long exposure photography is what happens at the long exposure end of things. Now, most digital cameras let you manually select a longest exposure of 30 seconds. And you can see you can do that with the X-T30 here. Now, 30 seconds is just an arbitrary figure. There's no reason that cameras should stop at 30 seconds and then force you to use bulb timers, but unfortunately that's the way it is with most brands. Panasonic and Olympus are the exceptions here because they let you go up to 60 seconds manually selectable. So does Fujifilm. But Fujifilm punishes all other brands in this respect by letting you go even further still. And why not? If I just turn the dial here, I can manually select an exposure of 2 minutes. How about 4 minutes, 8 minutes, 15 minutes? All manually selectable from the same dial that lets me go through the entire shutter speed range. I could then just take a long exposure with this, knowing that the camera will close the exposure after 15 minutes or whatever I've selected here, without the need for any expensive or awkward cable remotes or Wi-Fi connections, or having to go into menus and choose bulb timers. I really wish all cameras offered this extended shutter speed range in the same way as Fujifilm does. So thanks for implementing that, really appreciate it. Around the back of the camera, the most obvious change between the X-T30 and the model before it is the removal of the traditional 4 joypad style cross keys in the bottom right corner. These have been replaced with an AF joystick here, and like other cameras with AF joysticks, you can use it to move the AF area very easily. You can see it indicated here with the green square. However, the joystick also lets you move it diagonally, which is something you couldn't do with the cross keys, so you can actually get that AF area around the screen as quickly as you like. And it's also very convenient to use the joystick when you're composing through the viewfinder, although if you prefer, you could use the touch screen, and there is a touchpad style interface if you prefer to use the touch screen when composing, again, with the viewfinder. You can also use the joystick to navigate the menu system, and in fact I found it quite easy to use a combination of the touch screen and the joystick to select the options that I wanted. Now, the only thing to note is that the joystick's actual position here is a little low down when you're gripping the camera. Normally it would be positioned up here, so it would just be a bit of a reach to the side for your thumb. However, because of the small amount of real estate on the back of the camera, Fujifilm has had to push it down the rear surface here. Otherwise your thumb would be pushing onto it uncomfortably the entire time that you use the camera. So it's a little bit of a compromise, but it's one that I'm happy to make. More problematic though is the relocated Q menu button here, which finds itself atop this more pronounced thumb rest, and in operation I found it almost impossible to pick up the X-T30 without accidentally brushing the top of this button with my thumb and activating the Q menu itself on screen. It's a very, very sensitive button. So seeing that Q menu as soon as you pick up to the camera became a familiar and slightly frustrating sight. Now of course it's not that much effort to press the Q menu button again to make it disappear, or of course half press the shutter release to bring back the live view, but I think Fujifilm should look into ways to alleviate this problem a little with a firmware update. Perhaps they could program the button, I think best of all, to only bring up the Q menu with a prolonged push of it, maybe just for about 1 second or so, or to perhaps be able to disable it like on the X-T3, or maybe even reprogram the 2 focus and exposure lock buttons above it to take that function themselves. Speaking of prolonged pushes, this is how Fujifilm customizes its function buttons, and it's very easy to use in practice. If I were to customize this rear dial here, the push control on it, I just push and hold, and a couple of seconds later I have the actual menu giving me all of the customization options. I would like it to adjust the film simulations, so I'm going to select that. For the function button on the top of the camera, let's press and hold, and I'm going to use that to switch the face detection on and off, because sometimes the camera does recognize some other shapes as faces. And the front finger dial, if I push that in, it has a limited number of options here, but I'm going to have it change the ISO sensitivity. So now when I go back to using the camera, all I need to do is just push in this button here, and you can see that I can bring up those film simulations and use that thumb wheel to turn between them. I can use the function button here to turn face detection on and off. And I can use that front finger dial to bring up the ISO value. With essentially the same body as its predecessor, it's not surprising to find the X-T30 sharing the same screen articulation. So as before, you can angle up by about 90 degrees or down by about 45, which covers you for high, low or discrete shooting in the landscape orientation, but doesn't help you if you're shooting in the tall or portrait shape, and it won't flip forward to face you for selfies or for vlogging. Now, as a one-man operation who films a lot of videos for YouTube, I of course wish the X-T30 had a screen that flipped to face forward. In this regard, it is nowhere near as practical for me personally as the Sony A6400, and in fact I'm filming this clip with the A6400 with the screen flipped up above the body so I can see myself. It's so useful if you're filming stuff by yourself. But equally, I appreciate that this only affects a small number of people. It only affects vloggers or people shooting selfies, people who need to see themselves and who are working alone typically, which is most of us who are producing videos on YouTube, which is why you hear so many of us complaining about it. But again, I realize this only affects a small number of us, so if it doesn't bother you, then move on. But equally, if you do need a screen that faces forward, the X-T30 sadly isn't for you. But before I go, a little quick nod to Fujifilm, a respectful one, for one of the more considerate features in the camera industry, which is information that rotates to remain upright. So you can see now that when I turn the screen to the portrait orientation, the shooting information remains upright at the bottom, and it flips again when I turn it back to landscape. And this happens whether you're shooting with the viewfinder or the screen on the back. So thanks for that, Fujifilm. I think that's a really nice thing to continue to do. Not new, but I still like it nonetheless. Fujifilm's made good use of its touchscreen interface. You can of course tap the screen to reposition the AF area, and if you're filming movies you can also use the touchscreen to pull focus if you'd like. Inherited from other touchscreen Fujifilms is the ability to swipe across to bring up some custom controls. Here I've got the white balance, and if you like you can also use the joystick to control some of those. If I swipe left, you can see I've got access to the film simulations. Again, this is completely customizable. If you go into the Q menu system, you can touch your way through this interface as well. Let's change the quality here to RAW plus JPEG. However, if you were to go to the full menu system, you can't actually scroll your way through that. In playback though, you can swipe through images, and you can double tap to enlarge them and push them around. Scroll to have a closer look. So it's really nice to see Fujifilm making the most of its touchscreen, even if it doesn't quite go through the main menu system. Remember, it lets you do a great deal more than Sony does with theirs. In particular, Sony really does need to give you touch access to its function menu, as Fujifilm does here with its Q menu. The X-T30 inherits the 2.36 million dot OLED viewfinder of the X-T20 with its 0.62 times magnification. The resolution is comparable to other rivals at this price, but the magnification is now a bit smaller. The viewfinder on the Sony A6400, for instance, delivers a bigger image with 0.7 times magnification, and this is also a differentiator with the higher-end X-T3, whose viewfinder is larger still at 0.75 times and more detailed too, with 3.69 million dots. Behind the flap on the right hand side you'll find three fairly normal looking ports, a 2.5mm jack, USB-C and HDMI port, but each of these three connections has got something fairly unique about it. Starting with the 2.5mm jack at the top, is designed to connect an optional remote cord, but it can also be used to connect an external microphone. However, there is one catch. Here on the left I've got a connector for a typical Rode microphone that is 3.5mm in diameter. So in order to connect this to the X-T30 you're going to need some sort of adapter cable. Don't worry, they are available, you'll just have to remember to buy one. This has got a 2.5mm plug at one end and a 3.5mm jack on the other, so that will let you connect an external mic. Moving down to the USB-C port, I'm pleased to say that along with data transfer, you can use this port to both charge the battery and camera and also power the camera. So it means that when you're running low on battery, which you probably will at some point with this camera, you can just connect it to a handy USB-C power supply. I used my MacBook Pro's power supply without any problem, or some kind of external USB power bank. However, it has one other trick up its sleeve. Like a lot of modern mobile phones, this USB-C port can also be used as a headphone output, again with the appropriate adapter. However, this time the camera is a bit more fussy. I initially tried this Dekia USB-C to headphone adapter, and it worked absolutely fine when I connected headphones to my USB-C ports on my MacBook Pro, but it didn't work on the X-T30. Now, the reason for this, as far as I understand it, is that the Mac outputs a digital signal and it needs a cable with a built-in digital to analog converter, whereas the X-T30, I believe, outputs an analog signal, so it needs a different kind of cable, one that essentially just passes that analog information straight through the USB-C port and into a 3.5mm jack. Well, with the help of Fujifilm UK, we tracked down two adapters which did do the trick. There's the Sony EC260 and the Sony EC270, which, as you can see, also has a pass-through, so you can USB charge it as well as accessing the headphone jack. Now, these both worked absolutely fine on the X-T30, and if you have any additional experience on which adapters do work or don't work, please add them to the comments so that we can help everyone else choose the right adapters. However, what this whole process did teach me is that the USB-C port could end up being a really useful way to get microphone and headphone inputs onto smaller compact bodies. I know that there's an awful lot of compact cameras that I wish did have these facilities, and perhaps going forward USB-C with adapters is going to be a way that we can equip them with these facilities. And finally, that HDMI port at the bottom also has a special capability. It can actually output 10-bit 4K at 422, same as the X-T3. This is a very impressive capability on any camera, let alone one at the X-T30's price point, and it puts it ahead of models like Sony's A6400, which will only output 8-bit over the HDMI. So if you connect an external recorder and shoot in F-Log, you're going to have tons of dynamic range to play with. The X-T30 is equipped with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and the first thing it asks you out of the box when you turn it on is to pair it with your phone. After a bit of a ropey start with wireless, Fujifilm's really nailed it with its latest bodies and app updates, with the X-T30 using its Bluetooth to seamlessly embed locations or establish a Wi-Fi connection for full remote control or image transfer. In practice, it now all works very, very smoothly. The Fujifilm camera remote app seen here running on my Galaxy S7 phone still allows the usual Wi-Fi functionality, full remote control with a live view of the image and full exposure control, and the ability to receive images sent from the camera or to browse the images from the camera using your phone. Now, all three of these work with a Wi-Fi connection for speed. And like all Wi-Fi connections, it takes between maybe 15 and 30 seconds to actually connect. That initiation process is quite slow for Wi-Fi. And that was frustrating for this fourth option, the remote release, which on previous versions of the app would also use Wi-Fi simply to present a big button in the middle of the screen to take a picture. Now, other manufacturers like Canon and Panasonic do this over Bluetooth, and I'm pleased that Fujifilm now does that too. So if I go into this section of the app, you'll notice that I'm not connected over Wi-Fi, but I can simply press this big button on my phone and I can take a picture. It's as simple as that. It's very, very responsive. In fact, it's more responsive than Wi-Fi, and there was none of that mucking about waiting for it to connect, which takes about half a minute. And if I have the camera set to bulb or long exposure, I can also hold the shutter open using this option here. But I'm really pleased that Fujifilm has updated the app to now support the remote release over Bluetooth. This is supported on all Fujifilm cameras that have got Bluetooth. It's just an updated version of the app. And Fujifilm tell me that there are going to be more updates to the app coming soon. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do with that. The X-T30 is powered by the NP-W126S battery, a fairly modest 1260 mAh pack that's quoted for around 380 shots or about an hour of 4K video. In practice, I managed a mix of around 100 shots with Bluetooth tagging, some Wi-Fi transfers and a few minutes of video. I'd recommend carrying a spare battery or a USB power bank. For video alone, I managed 6 consecutive 10-minute 4K clips, confirming the hour-long quote, at which point the camera had become very warm and was warning of overheating. Here's an X-T30 with its battery about to run out. And it's gone. This battery is completely dead. However, you can power the camera with a USB-C connection. This is the cable and charger for my Apple MacBook Pro 13-inch. So if I just plug this into the port on the side, we can see first of all that I can charge the battery over USB, nothing new there. But if I actually now power up the camera, you can see that the USB source is actually powering the camera here. You can see this little icon above the empty battery. This icon is showing that it is running off USB power. Given the body size, it's not surprising to find only one card slot, although it's a bit disappointing Fujifilm hasn't taken the opportunity to upgrade it to UHS Class 2 speeds. In terms of burst shooting, the X-T30 can fire its mechanical shutter up to 8 frames per second, that's down from 11 from the X-T3 but still pretty quick. Or if you switch to the electronic shutter, you can shoot it up to 20 frames per second, or even up to 30 frames per second if you're willing to put up with a minor crop, and all of those are with continuous autofocus. So here's how the X-T30 sounds when it's shooting at 8 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. Now I was shooting fine JPEGs there, and in earlier tests I found that I could actually shoot roughly 100 fine JPEGs before the buffer filled, and that maintained that 8 frames per second speed before then dropping down to about 5 frames per second, and the camera took about 8 seconds to commit that to memory. Now if you switch to uncompressed RAW, I found that you could shoot about 17 frames before the buffer filled, and it took about 12 seconds for that buffer to empty. So again, it doesn't have a UHS Class 2 card slot, so it is going to slow down those write times, but are you going to be using this camera that much for action? And I should say that in fact more of a limiting factor with the X-T30 as well as other Fujifilm bodies is the kind of lens that you're using. If you're really into shooting action with a Fujifilm body, you really need to couple it with a lens that has an LM focusing motor. You'll find that those ones will give you the best results in a continuous focusing environment. Fujifilm's revamped its autofocus system and in particular made big improvements to face and eye detection, which now work at much longer distances than before. In this test, I'd say the Sony A6400 still holds the crown for face and eye detection across the frame and at longer distances, but the X-T30 is a huge improvement over its predecessors, and indeed it beats many other rivals. Also inherited from the X-T3 is the pre-burst mode, which uses the electronic shutter to keep a rolling buffer as you half press the shutter, then as you fully depress it, a handful of prior frames are recorded. In this sequence, I only pushed the shutter as the bird took flight, but the camera also managed to capture the moments immediately before. It's really handy when you're faced with unpredictable action, like a bird taking off. Like all Fujifilm bodies, the processing is applied with a selection of film simulations, which continue to deliver very pleasing results straight out of camera. I'm particularly fond of Velvia for a saturated punch, classic chrome for vintage classiness, and Acros for high contrast black and white, and I'm pleased to find Eterna now included here, which delivers natural looking video without grading. If you're shooting in black and white, the X-T30 also unlocks the Monochrome Adjustment menu first seen on the X-T3, which lets you warm or cool the result with a coloured tint. I really enjoyed using a mid-warm setting, which produced a classier result than a traditional sepia. Now for a selection of images I shot with the X-T30 using the XF 18-55mm kit lens, and all of them are JPEGs straight out of camera. If you want a closer look at any of them, head on over to my X-T30 review at cameralabs.com. In terms of photo quality, the X-T30 delivers essentially the same results as the X-T3 before it, not surprising given it shares the same sensor and image processor, so there's lots of details below 1600 ISO and the attractive processing we know from the film simulations. As always, it's highly personal, but I really like the output from these Fujifilm bodies, and before long you'll have an intuitive feel for which simulation to choose for a particular subject. As a mostly out-of-camera JPEG shooter, I'm a big fan of Fujifilm's approach, and I don't feel I need to do anything in post to improve the output. Indeed, that's one of the big appeals for me of using the system, coupled with the controls and the broad selection of APS-C lenses. Before moving on, here's an ISO sequence starting at the base sensitivity of 160 ISO. Like the X-T3 before it, there's loads of detail up to 800 ISO, with some softening at 1600 and a more significant reduction in detail at 3200 ISO onwards. Interestingly, when shooting under the same conditions with the Sony A6400 and Canon EOS RP using exactly the same shutter speed, aperture and sensitivity, their images came out a little brighter than the X-T30, indicating their ISO values are actually a bit more sensitive than those same numbers on the X-T30. The X-T30 inherits some of the X-T3's movie capabilities with the ability to film uncropped 4K at 24 to 30p or 1080 at 24 to 60p. It understandably misses out on 4K at 60p, but the biggest restriction is the maximum clip length of just 10 minutes in 4K and 15 minutes in 1080, at a time when the A6400 removes all restrictions and can actually record 4K for as long as you have power or memory remaining. But don't rule out the X-T30 for video, as it's actually very good. First, here's a clip filmed in 4K, and remember the X-T30 can capture 4K uncropped up to 30p, unlike the A6400 which is only uncropped at 24 and 25p. And at this point I should say that all of the video samples that I'm posting from the X-T30 were filmed with the Eterna profile, which produces really nice output straight out of camera. Now for the same view filmed in 1080p, again available uncropped between 24 and 60p. And now back to 4K, but this time filmed in F-Log for those who like to grade their footage later. Now the Sony also has an S-Log profile, but it can only record it in 8-bit internally and externally over the HDMI. Now the X-T30 also records internally at 8-bit, but has the benefit of delivering 10-bit 422 over HDMI to an external recorder. So if you do use an external recorder, that is a key benefit the X-T30 has over the A6400. If you want higher speed recording than 60p, you can enable the high speed mode, which films up to 6 minutes of 1080p without sound at 100p or 120p, then interprets it in camera to 24, 25 or 30p for a 4 or 5 times slowdown. In this sequence you're watching a bunch of clips that I filmed at 100p and had the camera reduced to 25p to fit in this timeline, so you're looking at everything 4 times slower than normal. Now the high speed mode applies a 1.29 times crop and also films without sound. Compare that to the Sony's 120p mode, which does record audio and works with continuous autofocus too. In terms of resolving power at 1080p, here's the X-T30 on the left hand side, with the Sony A6400 in the middle and the Canon EOS RP on the right, all filming in 1080 25p, where I'd say the X-T30 on the left is comfortably out-resolving the other two cameras. Switching to 4K at 25p, the Sony improves a great deal, but I'd still say the X-T30 enjoys a slight edge over it, but the EOS RP falls behind both of its APS-C rivals. And remember, the EOS RP incurs a big crop when filming in 4K, while also reverting to a less sophisticated AF system too, so don't always assume the camera with the bigger sensor is going to win this kind of battle. Now back to the X-T30, where there's full manual control over exposure and the chance to enable silent movie controls, which are operated via the touchscreen. This has the benefit of ignoring the physical dials and effectively allowing you to set separate values for aperture, shutter and ISO for stills and video. I often made use of this, setting the exposure in manual for movies with a motion-friendly shutter of say a 50th of a second, while leaving the stills mode to aperture priority with generally much faster shutter speeds. You can also navigate it with the joystick if you prefer. As before, it's possible to tap the screen to pull focus, although like the X-T3, while there's no hunting back and forth, the pulls can sometimes become a little hesitant with minor pauses here and there. In this respect, it's not as confident as the Sony or Canon bodies. Face and eye detection work in movies, and while there's again some hesitation, the X-T30 will get there if you pause from time to time. So again, in my experience, it's not as confident as the best of its rivals, in this case Sony and Canon, in this regard, but definitely very usable. Now of course your mileage may vary depending on the conditions you film in. And I'd also say the X-T30 is sufficiently reliable for its face detection for vlogging blindly, as you'll see in the next clip. Hello, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is a quick vlogging test with the Fujifilm X-T30. Not your first choice for vlogging because the screen doesn't face forward, so you can't see what's going on. You don't even know if you're recording. In fact, a quick note to self here, why don't the manufacturers of cameras actually use the AF illuminators on the front of them to maybe just flash on and off a little bit when you're recording video? Be a really nice indicator, wouldn't it? But anyway, moving on with the X-T30. Now, if the screen can't face you and the clips are limited to 10 minutes for 4K and there's no built-in stabilization, well, why would you want to use it for vlogging? Well, I would use it because I think the quality is really very nice. It will film 4K at 24, 25 or 30p uncropped. Compare that to the Sony A6400, which at 30p crops its 4K. You also get really nice color processing straight out of camera. I've got this filming with the Eterna film simulation. This produces a nice flat, but not too flat, image straight out of camera that I think looks really nice and doesn't need any additional grading. So your footage is good to go. And even though I can't see myself, I'm confident enough that the face detection coupled with phase detection across the entire sensor is sufficiently good to keep me in focus wherever my face may end up on the frame. Now I'm recording the audio here with the built-in microphones, but if you prefer there is a microphone input, although it is only 2.5mm, so if you're using typical external microphones you will need an adapter for that. But fairly uniquely for a camera, the X-T30 can actually use its USB-C port as a headphone jack, just like a lot of modern phones can. So if you get the right adapter, and it does have to be the right adapter, I've already tried one which doesn't work, you can connect a 3.5mm, say, headphone to it, which gives it a really nice benefit, again, over the Sony A6400, which doesn't have a headphone solution. So, as always, pros and cons to all cameras. There could be a reason why you would want to use this. Oh, and just before moving on, what lens am I using? This is the XF 18-55mm kit zoom. 18mm f2.8. I know my head is too big on the frame, but you could always fit the XF 10-24 if you really get into this sort of thing. I'm using optical stabilization in the lens, and I'm holding the camera with a small monopod, attempting to do a bit of a cheapy gimbal solution, so I hope the footage isn't too wobbly for you. Anyway, on with the review. The Fujifilm X-T30 follows a tried and trusted recipe now on its third generation, delivering the same sensor, processing and autofocus of the flagship model, in this case the X-T3, in a smaller, lighter and much more affordable body. As such, it becomes the second body to feature Fujifilm's latest 26-megapixel APS-C X-Trans4 sensor with phase detect autofocus across the entire frame and electronic bursts up to 30 frames per second with optional pre-burst capture too. As you'd expect, the output essentially matches the X-T3, delivering great looking photos out of camera, and the 4K video up to 30p is amongst the best of its peer group. 1080 footage, often neglected in the 4K world, also looks great. Fujifilm's also done a lot of work on its AF system, with the face and eye detection now working much better than before, and the wireless connectivity is also more reliable too. I was also pleased to find the USB port doubling as a headphone output, and the HDMI port outputting 4K in 10-bit 422 to an external recorder, both unusual features at this price point. On the downside, there's no built-in image stabilization, there's a single card slot that only supports UHS 1 speeds, the movie clips are short, limited to just 10 minutes of 4K or only 15 minutes in 1080p. The viewfinder image is smaller than most rivals, the battery life is fairly short, the movie autofocus isn't as decisive as Sony or Canon, and vloggers will wish the screen faced forward. Yes, I know it's only a few of us, but I've got to say it. Some of these can be attributed to the size of the body though, and it's also true to say there's not much to wrap your fingers around. The tightly arranged ports may block each other if they have larger plugs, and the repositioned Q menu button really does get pressed by accident far too often. But equally, the X-T30 is designed to be a small camera. There's always going to be physical compromises with a compact body, and it's aimed at travel and portability, for which it excels. So what do you get if you spend $500 or £500 extra on the X-T3? Well, the flagship body is larger, more comfortable and weatherproofed. It has twin UHS 2 card slots. It'll film 4K up to 60p, as well as extending 30p clips to half an hour. It shoots faster with a 1/8000th of a second shutter speed and 11 frames per second mechanical bursts. It has proper 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks, and they're spaced further apart so they won't block each other. A much larger and more detailed viewfinder image, and a screen that can angle out sideways a little bit for easier framing in the portrait orientation at low angles, albeit not going as far as to face forward. The X-T3 is a lovely camera, but the X-T30 matches its photo and movie quality, albeit up to 30p with shorter clips, in a much more portable body while saving you $500, which could be spent on lenses, travel, or, occasional coffee donations to a deserving gear vlogger. For roughly the same price, there's also Sony's A6400 to consider. In its favour, the A6400 has a larger viewfinder image, a deeper grip, weather sealing, a screen that can face forward, more confident movie autofocus, at least in my tests, and unlimited 4K recording times. On a single battery with a 64GB card, I got a clip lasting just over an hour in 4K, uninterrupted. The X-T30 fights back with a headphone output, 10-bit 422 over HDMI, and to my own personal preference, better controls and more attractive output, although you may prefer the Sony in these regards. I think the X-T30's real trump card over the Sony though is access to a far broader selection of native APS-C lenses. Both are however really strong bodies for both stills and video, and I can recommend either of them. Ultimately, I really enjoyed my time with the X-T30, and while the small body resulted in a few annoyances and inevitable compromises, I still appreciated its portability, especially when coupled with one of the smaller lenses in the system. It's perfect for travel and very discreet for street photography too. As a fan of the X-T3, I knew I'd like the images straight out of camera, and I'm also fond of Fujifilm's controls and styling. Now, I appreciate image processing and control preferences are entirely personal, but there's no arguing with the X system's lens catalogue, which simply has far greater choice than rival APS-C systems from Sony and Canon, especially when it comes to primes. For me, it's this combination of effortless photo quality, attractive styling, and an unrivaled lens selection in its peer group that makes the X system so compelling. So if you want access to all of this in a compact body at a mid-range price, the X-T30 comes highly recommended. If you find my reviews useful, don't forget to subscribe, and if you really like them, you can support me by checking prices, treating me to a coffee, or treating yourself to my in-camera book, all using the links below. If you're looking for even more information or my latest buyer's guides, you'll find them all at cameralabs.com. And again, if you're interested in my personal photography, you can check it out on Instagram or Twitter using the @cameralabs handle. Thanks for watching, let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.